Dr. Frank Aubrey got his Bachelor of Arts in the University of California, Riverside, master's and doctorate from the University of Texas. He has taught evolution since 1960. He is interested in natural history, and he does research on bioacoustics. Let's give him a welcome as he comes tonight.
Thank you very much. I suppose this is the first time a lot of you have seen a real live evolutionist. I came out here tonight to the lamb's lair. Can't call you lions because you're Christians. To tell you why the scientific community opposes creation science. It's not because we're committed to a particular theory. It's because we're committed to science. And we see creation scientists doing things that just don't follow the rules of science. Instead of playing by the rules of science, where you present a hypothesis and you present the data to support it, we've seen them go to legislatures and try to get it legislated into existence. Well, I'm here to give you some facts that you won't normally get from creation scientists. You may well know that 72 Nobel laureates and 17 academies of science and 7 other scientific organizations have all signed an amicus curiae brief in the hearing before the Supreme Court on the Louisiana creation law. In the October '86 Acts and Facts, an article appeared that used some nice pejorative terms, that this was a clever ploy accompanied by media propaganda, and that for you to have the proper perspective on this, you should realize that a Nobel laureate is someone who is highly specialized in a narrow field, and that they really don't know anything about evolution or the evolution-creation controversy. And essentially that, in that case, their opinions don't count. Well, that was inspired, I must admit. It was really inspirational, a way to make believers feel good, but it's nonsense. Do you really believe that the world's best scientists have to step outside their own field to evaluate the way creation science affects it? Creation scientists oppose modern views not only in biology, but in physics, thermodynamics, astrophysics, quantum theory, relativity, biochemistry, physical chemistry, genetics, molecular biology, you name it. They're trying to do something impossible. They're trying to come at science upside down and backwards. And when they do this, they find themselves in opposition with all science. Well, then the article goes on with another inspirational statement. It says, we have thousands of qualified scientists who are creationists. And I'll note the implication here. Thousands of fully qualified scientists. What this is implying, the whole thing, is that anybody but a creation scientist knows nothing outside a narrow area. And that one scientist is just as good as another, maybe better. A man with a PhD in biochemistry can tell the Nobel laureate in thermodynamics why he's wrong. It's a little audacious, I think. Nobel Prize is not given for whether they're nice guys or what their opinions are. It's given for accomplishments. Accomplishments in science that are so great that they change the course of history. They change the world. Now, I'm going to compare some accomplishments here. I've taken these statements, general sort of things, from ICR Impacts, Scientific Creationism, Fossils Say No, and other creationist works. Some of the Nobel laureates who signed this, Chandrasekhar and Fowler, got the Nobel Prize for stellar evolution. Creation science, on the other hand, says about this, stars can't form. A large section in scientific creationism proving that stars can't form. Unfortunately, just this year, an article in Nature, and on the 1st of October '86 in the Astrophysics Journal Letters are 2 articles showing new light from brand new stars. The one in the Astrophysics Journal is only 560 light years away. giving you some implications about you can't say it happened before creation. Creation scientists are very proud of a new textbook they have, a new physics. This new physics denies relativity theory that Einstein got the Nobel Prize for, and it denies quantum mechanics. Well, some people unaware of this. Towns got the Nobel Prize for using quantum mechanics to develop lasers and masers. Some of you may have had lasers used on you. We have a laser here tonight to point to the board, or to point up to the pictures. Bardeen and his colleagues used quantum mechanics to develop semiconductors, transistors. You see them there working to film this tonight. The transistors, that is. I don't think Bardeen's here. Huffman got the Nobel Prize for quantum chemistry. Physical chemists can't imagine doing chemistry now without using quantum mechanics. And yet, creation scientists have a physics book that shows there's no such thing. Physicists I know who have read it sort of laughed and shook their heads. Said, well, what are you going to do? Creation scientists say no theory of origins is testable. Well, Penzias and Wilson got the Nobel Prize for finding the black body radiation background in the universe. That is the ringing from the original Big Bang. They confirmed a 20-year-old theory that this should be found if there had been a Big Bang. Seaborg got the Nobel Prize for discovering uranium and for doing research in transuranic elements. Creation scientists say things like, there isn't any such thing as radiometric dating, and they can show it because iron-57, for example, changes its half-life, and so there's no such thing as a constant half-life. Unfortunately, iron-57 is a stable isotope. Well, some other Nobel laureates, McClintock for showing mobile genes in corn, Watson and Crick for DNA is the gene, Berg for recombinant DNA. These discoveries are already saving lives. They're saving people from disease, and they are feeding millions. Extremely important, changing the world all around. So don't get the idea that these scientists don't know what they're talking about. They do. They can evaluate what creationists have said about their fields, and they have voted by doing something no group of laureates has ever done before. None of them, you've never gotten 72 of them, to agree on anything before. They're a contentious bunch. They agreed on this, and they signed it gladly. So you can't dismiss that brief glibly. Creationists often are logically inconsistent. We sort of insist in science that if you have a theory, it be logically consistent. For example, they tell us that the theory of evolution is just a theory. Well, none of us really disagree with that because we know that science deals only with theories. There's nothing in science but theories. Theories are what we use to explain facts and to predict new facts. So I'm not at all bothered when they tell us that the theory of evolution is a theory. Seems reasonable. But then we hear it's unfalsifiable, and therefore it's not a theory at all, it's a religion. And then a little bit later on we hear, but it's been falsified. So it's not falsifiable, but it's been falsified. The sort of inconsistency, this talking in circles, is enough to make my head swim sometimes. Me and a lot of my colleagues. It's easy to miss the illogic here if you just look at these things one at a time. Any good scientist could mention to you lots of different ways that you can imagine that would falsify the theory of evolution. If, for example, you found a random mix of living and extinct species in the fossil record, just randomly mixed. You looked in the lowest fossil deposits and you found elephants and rhinoceros along with trilobites and bacteria and things like this, and then coming up all the way through a random mixture of species. It would be awfully hard to explain that in terms of the descent of new organisms modified from their ancestors, which is really what evolution says. Evolution postulates that Species are the modified descendants of different species. Or if you found a species that would deliberately go extinct so some other species would benefit. And if this were a common thing, that would demolish natural selection. Or if you found that when you use some method for establishing relationships, anatomy, you look at skeletons, and you see that human beings have a skeleton that's very like that of the apes. But then you look at their chromosomes, and lo and behold, human chromosomes are like earthworm chromosomes. And then we look at their albumin, for example, blood protein, and it's like a bullfrog's albumin. Evolution would be in real serious trouble. On the other hand, the reason we say that creation science basically is not science is because its central tenet is that it was accomplished by a supernatural, omnipotent, omniscient deity. And there isn't anything that such a deity couldn't do. It could have created me and all of us here 30 milliseconds ago with all of our memories intact, arguing about whether we were created 30 milliseconds ago. And we'd never ever know the difference. Could mix up species in any way or put species in the sediments to make it look like they had been deposited there over 3.5 or 4 billion years in a certain order. No trick at all. Do it right away. Any of these things could do. Science is a hard-nosed business. It has strict rules. We go on facts, not opinions. And we are bound, we're duty-bound, to find and correct errors wherever we see them. And that's why I've taken on scientific creationism. Not because I enjoy the time that it takes. I'd rather be out chasing whales in Antarctica. It's a lot more fun. But I feel an obligation to science to do this. And since I'm in San Diego, well, somebody had to do it. So I did. In science, we use strong criticism. It's not a personal attack. We're attacking the science that somebody does when we see it as bad science. That's just the standard rule of the business. And your defense, the defense that scientists do for this, if you read Science or Nature or any other journal, you'll know that somebody writes an article, often somebody else writes in and says that's hogwash. Your defense has to be to marshal facts, not somebody else's opinion, not some irrelevant statement to take people's mind off of what you said, but facts, facts, and more facts. Now, a lot of creation scientists, what they call evidence, consists of quotes from evolutionists. You hear this in every debate. That doesn't faze Dr. Gish a bit. A lot of it is mistaken. A lot of it is straw men. And as I've shown you before, a lot of it is just plain illogical. And sometimes they just don't tell you the whole story. Here's a quote from Scientific Creationism. It's from Davis, 1949, and which he says, divine creation is just as reasonable as anything else. You can't refute it it's paleontology by itself can't prove or refute such ideas. And I agree. In science, we don't use any one line of evidence. We don't use paleontology by itself. In fact, evolution doesn't rest on the fossil record. The fossil record supports it, but it was devised without help from the fossil record. Here's the full text of the quote. Note what was left out. With other interpretations that have been discredited by neobiological work. For example, divine creation, innate developmental processes, Lamarckism, and so on. Really isn't right to leave that out when you're quoting it as evidence against evolution. It's trying to imply that Davis, when he wrote this, thought that divine creation was just as good an idea to explain his observations as was the theory of evolution. Critical words being left out, and you can find lots and lots and lots of that. Scientific creationism, page 18, sets up a straw man. Evolutionists would predict that matter, energy, and laws of nature are still evolving. But creation scientists wouldn't. Creation scientists say, aha, that's all finished. It stopped right then and there. Ladies and gentlemen, come on, get serious. This is silly. If we didn't accept uniformitarianism, that is, that laws have not changed, do not change, we couldn't go into the laboratory because we'd go in and say, well, I'd go in to work and I'd want to stick my hydrophone in the water and I'd scratch my head and say, well, I wonder what speed of sound in water is going to be today. Or, you know, you read this and you get the idea that we wouldn't be a bit surprised if we all went flying right off the earth tomorrow because gravity suddenly changed, went out of existence. Nope. When a chemist goes into the laboratory, he knows that if he mixes sodium and chlorine together, he's going to get salt and not something else. So that's a straw man. And a rather preposterous straw man, too. Then a little bit later on, tells that the evolution model is fundamentally tied to uniformitarianism. According to creationism, you have a past history of special constructive processes and a period of special destructive processes. In other words, natural laws now aren't what they used to be. So within the same book, you hear that creationism demands, uses constant laws. Evolution doesn't. And then a few pages later, evolution is criticized for depending on constant laws, whereas creationism now suddenly has inconstant laws. It's like little kids, you know, when you're playing cops and robbers, bang, bang, I got you. No, play like you missed me. Uniformitarianism means natural laws invariant with time, and that there is no supernatural agency involved here. You're not going to have your experiments modified in some mysterious, unpredictable way by some supernatural force. We think we're not even going to have them modified that way by some super intelligent aliens somewhere, but you never know, it could happen. However, we don't postulate that. Another straw man, logically contradictory, goes on and on and on, and I could go on, but you get the point, I think. Furthermore, the mistakes that get made get perpetuated. In scientific creationism, you read that Calaveras man is a human fossil from the tertiary, long before humans were supposed to have evolved. However, it's been well known for a long time that Calaveras man was a fraud. It was planted there as a joke by T.C. Scribner, a local shop owner in Calaveras County. He admitted it to his sister and to his priest on his deathbed. And go read hoaxes, you'll find it right there. On the other hand, the last time I mentioned this in a debate, Dr. Gish stood up and said, but it is in the tertiary, and I don't dispute that. It was there, but it was put there. So it really ought to come out of the creationist books as a good example of a fossil out of place, because it is not. Another one, Peking man lived in Australia only 10,000 years ago. Well, now evolutionists say that Peking man, which is Homo erectus, went extinct 500,000 or so years ago. A little difficult for it to be around 10,000 years ago if it's been extinct for 500,000 years. But you notice the reference to this. It's a 1972 Scientific American article. It's a little secondary thing called Science and the Citizen, which is just a matter of sort of general interest. And what the scientists said was that from the looks of the skeletons they found that were about 10,000 years old, they seemed to have some Homo erectus genes still in them. Not Homo erectus. They had some traits that were a little bit Homo erectus-like, so that you say, hey, you can still see some of these genes here. They haven't quite faded out of the population yet. Those kinds of mistakes that come from superficial treatment are why the scientific community doesn't take creation science seriously. Human evolution. This is where it's really at. Oops. Separate ancestry for man and apes. This is one of the major tenets of scientific creationism. It was part of the Arkansas law that was turned down. You read, you hear that Solly's Lord Zuckerman and Charles Oxnard both studied Lucy, and based on their careful studies of Lucy, which is Australopithecus afarensis, the oldest known Australopithecus, the oldest definite hominid, that is in the human family, it's an ape. Well, the unfortunate thing about this is that neither of them have ever seen Lucy. Well, I take it back, Oxnard has seen Lucy since. Zuckerman never studied Lucy. Lucy was found after Zuckerman's book came out in 1970, Beyond the Ivory Tower. So when anybody tells you that he refuted Lucy, they're just plain old wrong. And I like the answer to this, by the way, in a recent Acts and Facts. It was, well, now, if the animals they found came after Lucy, they should have been even more human-like, and they weren't. An irrelevancy. It's not an answer to the charge. Nobody today puts Australopithecus on the direct lineage to human beings, at least not the Australopithecines that Zuckerman and Oxnard have been arguing about. 20 years ago, when they made these arguments, some people were trying to. Now they know they're right. Australopithecines are a parallel lineage. This is Lucy, 100% ape. Anybody can see that. All you do is look at that pelvis, complete ape pelvis, all the bones, total ape bones, especially that skull, the teeth, and so on. And indeed, it is a lot like an ape. And why shouldn't it be if it's an early transitional form? This is an example, if the creationists are right in what they say Zuckerman is saying, that Australopithecus was 100% ape. It was not like a human. You should be able to make a prediction here. Here's a gorilla, the jaw. This is, you take off the lower jaw and you look right up into the roof of the mouth. Boy, better stop getting so violent here. On the other hand, this is looking at a human being's palate, upper jaw. Now you should be able to make a prediction. If Australopithecus is nothing but an ape, which one of these should it look like? Some evidence now, folks, for you to make your own minds here. Kinds of facts that I never see in scientific creationist books. There it is. This is out of W. LeGros Clark's 1964 book, The Fossil Evidence for Human Evolution, where he took Solly Zuckerman apart piece by piece. Here is the lineage now. This is until another fossil was found just a few weeks ago. This is the way it's set up. This is Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, and then there's a split. And this is the Australopithecines, Africanus and Robustus. Down here is Homo, our genus, human beings, starting with Homo habilis, then Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, that's us, means man the wise. Seems a little egotistical, doesn't it? I didn't name it, Linnaeus did. I don't mind. I like to think I'm wise. Now, this new fossil, WT 17,000, doesn't really change anything about Homo's lineage. If you read Discover magazine from the issue before last, there was an article in there you would have thought this just totally revised, totally threw all of human evolution into an uproar. It doesn't. It's thrown what happened with the Australopithecines into some question. But not a tremendous amount of question. The article was way out of line. There's been an article in Science since telling what really went on. Well, let's look at how creationists handle these fossils. In The Fossils Say No, you read that Peking man, Homo erectus, remember, must have been a large monkey-like or ape-like creature. Big monkey. And it's supposed to be our ancestor. It's supposed to have been, in fact, the species immediately preceding Homo sapiens. It diverged into Homo sapiens. Whoops, if you read scientific creationism, you read that Homo erectus was a true man. A little degenerate in size, but a true human being. You get that those two books overlapped in time, by the way. Here is the skeleton of a 12-year-old boy, 1.6 million years old, dug up in Kenya. It's the oldest known Homo erectus specimen, 5 feet 6 inches tall at 12 years of age. They weren't degenerate in size at all. Homo erectus skull. Doesn't look like a monkey to me, but then, maybe if you don't know comparative anatomy, it does. But if you look at where the spine attaches to the skull, that animal had to walk upright. Well, let's go on. Here we go, Homo habilis, Leakey's skull, 1470. Essentially the same as a modern human, except a little smaller. A picture of it. This is a picture of the original bones as they've been mounted on plasticine. Beautiful looking thing. It looks human, doesn't it? Anybody can see that? I went down to the Natural History Museum where they have a precision mold, or precision cast, I should say, of 1470, which is Homo habilis, and asked if I could take some pictures. And they said, sure, so they let me have the thing. I held it in my hands, I looked at it, and I laid it down beside a Homo sapiens skull. You can see, people don't come with those little hooks on their skulls, by the way, folks. If you look underneath your skin, you don't have those on there. This is a medical specimen. That's the only one they had there for me to look at. I said, oh, well, I've seen one skull. What the heck? There's a lot of differences here. There are a lot of similarities, but if you notice, the top of the skull is quite different. And the amount of the skull that comes out beyond the eye ridges is quite different. And the size of the face, if you look at it from the side, you see that the face is as long as a human face, but the skull is a little bitty thing. It was a pinhead, relatively speaking. Had a brain size about half that of a modern human being. And you look at it from the top, and there's no way that's a modern human being, folks. I have to conclude from what I've just read you there, it's a reasonable conclusion, that the scientific creationists who are writing about this and proposing that they have falsified these ideas have never examined those specimens. But you can. You can go down to the Natural History Museum, and they've got Peking man there too. Now you may read in creationist publications that there are a couple of little slivers of bone or something. The Peking man fossils, Homo erectus, were lost in World War II. Nobody knows exactly how. They were lost in shipment, but precision casts of them were made. And these precision casts, one set of them is right down here at the Museum of Man. Others at other museums around the country. The guys who were digging these up knew what was happening, and they weren't stupid. They made precision casts of them, and you can tell an awful lot from a precision cast of the bones and the skulls. Now, I want to set the record straight here. Last year, when I presented this material, in Acts and Facts, volume 14, number 11, the report of this debate accused me of artificially rearranging the data that I showed then. That is not true. And if you can prove it, write to Boas and his colleagues and the editors of Nature. They should know about it. I showed a picture right from an article in Nature by Boas and some colleagues of his who are well-known, respected anthropologists, and they did not artificially rearrange their data to make it look like evolution had happened. So this year I used a little better picture. This is out of National Geographic. It's not as scientifically accurate, but it shows Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and then interestingly it says Homo sapiens archaic. This is a Petrolona skull found in Petrolona, Greece. It is exactly intermediate in all the characteristics used to discriminate between Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. It falls right on the line. And so half the anthropologists are lined up saying, why, that's Homo erectus. and the other half are lined up saying, no, by the characteristics I use, it's Homo sapiens. So here it's called an archaic Homo sapiens. Then there's Homo neanderthal. Now, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis is not, supposedly, on the direct lineage to people either. Even though it's placed in here, it's just another Homo sapiens. Little bit different, well, quite a bit different skull shape. It went extinct, maybe interbred with the Homo sapiens around at the time, until finally you come here to Homo sapiens, as we have been for about the last, estimates vary, 400,000 years or so. The only conclusion that's reasonable here is that the fossils overwhelmingly say yes to human evolution, as well as to other evolution. Now, science doesn't just stop here. We're not satisfied to say, see, we had some nice fossils, and go rest on our laurels, whatever else we could do. Instead, people go out there and they keep digging and they say, you might be wrong about those fossils. Can you show me some other kind of evidence that might be used to evaluate this? Because we know that if a scientific idea is right, and there's more than one way to evaluate it. If you read Scientific American articles, you see this all the time. They come at a problem from a half a dozen different directions. Independent lines of evidence have to agree about human phylogeny, about our evolutionary relationships. Now, a good way that's been used to look at this is with proteins. Proteins are very close to the gene. They're almost the immediate gene product. If you can look at proteins, you essentially are looking at genes, and it's a real good way to get an idea of what's gone on in evolution, because as organisms diverge in time evolutionarily, they diverge not only in body form, but also in their genes. And so you should see parallel reflection of the same process, whether you're looking at genes, or you're looking at skeletons, or you're looking at chromosomes, whatever. You can predict that our genes will not look like redwood genes, exactly, but we will have some similarities with redwood genes, because the theory of descent with modifications is at one time there was an organism that was neither redwood nor human that gave rise to both. So, the creation scientists knew this, knew that it was a way to falsify evolution, and so they published. And these are the data that were published, that if you looked at fetal hemoglobin, the fetal hemoglobin that was most like that of the human was not an ape, but a horse. Tear enzymes, these are lysozymes. Chicken was more like human than any ape was like a human. Albumin, the bullfrog. Jugarum. You've all seen the bullfrog out there in the pond. There's our nearest relative as far as albumin is concerned. Blood antigen A, the butter bean, cholesterol level, the garter snake, milk chemistry, the donkey. Well, I went and I looked at some of these things. Cholesterol level, you can't use that for anything. It fluctuates tremendously, and it's not a protein. Cholesterol is a lipid. I don't know how that got in there. Beats me. Blood antigen A, the butter bean, it turns out that the blood antigens have a sugar in them. And it's the same sugar, simple sugar, that butter beans have. And that's where the reaction is, and it's a really weak reaction. But you get a strong reaction with any other animal species, much stronger, and strongest reactions of all to blood antigens when you use either another human being or an ape. Well, there we are. There's our bullfrog relative. Now, we've been trying to find out what the source of this was for a long time. We finally have heard that it came from a classroom where these data were discussed. We talked to the man who ran the class, and he said, no, it was a joke. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. Here you go. The real data say that there are about 6 differences. 6 amino acid sequence differences between human and chimpanzee albumin, whereas the bullfrog now, there are more than 200 amino acid differences. You don't even get a reaction in this particular method that they use for determining how near or how like these proteins are. And this is from Wallace and Wilson, the Journal of Molecular Evolution. And I know Wilson, he's a good colleague of mine. He and I shared a graduate student one time. The number of amino acid differences between human fetal hemoglobin and that of the chimpanzee, they are identical. There are no differences. Horse doesn't have fetal hemoglobin, so it would be awfully hard for a horse fetal hemoglobin to be more like ours than one that's identical with ours. Really puzzling. And I have yet to hear where these data came from. I've been trying to find out for 5 years now, and all I've ever gotten is stonewalling. Human lysozyme, these are the tear enzymes, or the chicken egg white enzymes. Chimpanzee and human lysozyme is identical, whereas the chicken lysozyme differs by 51 amino acids from ours. So the actual biochemical data show that the chimpanzee, primates, are closest to us for everything except cholesterol, where everything's the same. There is only one cholesterol molecule for everything. Well, the joke in that class, somebody said, you know, they just found a bullfrog whose albumin is just like that of the human being. And they said, really? I bet he's Northern European. Yep, an enchanted prince. And a creationist, who will remain nameless for this, I don't want to try to embarrass anybody, took this as fact and perpetuated it. Not much of a source for scientific data. Okay, other kinds of evidence. The biochemical evidence certainly support human evolution. Now, my opponent here and I have argued back and forth about tails on human beings. You know, every once in a while a human is born with a tail, a little baby, and the doctor snips it off and tells the parent, yeah, your kid had a little fatty cyst there and we took it off. But it's a tail. This is from standard book in developmental anatomy. And it shows, if you'll notice, this little tail coming out. It's not a pretty thing. But my opponent argued that you find these tails, but they're nothing but fatty cysts because they never have any skeletal elements in them. And they never have any muscles in them. You notice it says, this specimen was soft but slightly mobile and is shown in its contracted state. Contractions come from muscles, ladies and gentlemen. And a few have contained skeletal elements. It's a vestigial organ. And it's a vestigial organ of the right kind, too. It's one that you can't claim has some unknown function because it's rare. When it shows up, it doesn't have a function, and it's sort of, as you can see, klutzy looking because it is just a long leftover heritage, genetic heritage from our ancestors. So now we have several different lines of evidence, all agreeing, Aries picture, developmental evidence here, that humans did descend from non-human ancestors. Well, we're not the only things that descended from different ancestors, of course. Other species did too. The claim. Now, the theory of evolution, anatomists, comparative anatomists, paleontologists have been looking at these things for a long time, looked at a bunch of mammals. Well, a bunch of reptiles actually, but they were a lot like mammals. And they looked at these things over a long period. You could see a long train of transitional species in which they went gradually from being a reptile, a stem reptile they're called, a cotylosaur, to finally mammals. And you could see a gradual transition of all kinds of characteristics occurring over this long time. Exactly the process that we're assured is impossible and that there's no kind of evidence for. Now, mammals and reptiles are a lot alike. At least these mammal-like reptiles are a lot like mammals. I don't think any of you would mistake an elephant for an alligator. So there are differences between reptiles and mammals. But these mammal-like reptiles that went extinct back in the Mesozoic were quite different from most reptiles. They were very much like mammals at the end of this. And in fact, the way you tell whether you have a specimen, whether a specimen is a mammal or a reptile, is whether its jaw has one bone in it and its middle ear has 3 bones. Then it's a mammal. If its jaw has several bones in it and only one in the middle ear to conduct sound from the eardrum to the middle ear, then it's a reptile. That's a diagnostic difference. It's not the only difference. There's a whole bunch of it. If you read McGowan's book on creationism and evolution, he comes up with a whole long table of differences and shows those that are mammalian, reptilian, and those that are intermediate in these mammal-like reptiles. Well, this is a good argument because evolutionists say that the origin of these 2 extra bones in our middle ear, these used to be the jaw joint in these reptiles. Now I realize that's preposterous. It sounds really ridiculous. And it sounds really good to say, how could it chew or hear? Science often asks you to believe things that are ridiculous and preposterous. Because, well, for example, how fast are you going right now? How fast are you moving as you sit here with your rear ends going to sleep on these hard benches? What if I told you you're moving but almost 67,000 miles an hour right now? Come on. Well, the Earth is going around the sun. Those of us who aren't geocentrists accept that anyway. And if you calculate it out, 365.25 days to go around a circle of 93 million miles radius, it comes out to 63,600 and something miles an hour. Counterintuitive. You bet it's counterintuitive. But there's a lot of evidence that it's true. If that weren't true, then all the space probes that we launched to the moon and the other planets would have missed by untold distances. The equations wouldn't have worked. Well, you can't chew, you can't hear, it's counterintuitive, but there's evidence for it. 5 known reptile lines in these cyanognathes had this mammalian and reptilian jaw joint at the same time, side by side, and they chewed and they heard, I assume they heard. Maybe they didn't hear, but they certainly chewed because they grew up and they had little babies that gave rise to more little babies. Here is, I'm sorry for giving you some hard stuff that those of you who don't know anything about anatomy will have a hard time really picturing what's going on here. This is a jaw, the lower jaw. This is the angular, which is the bone that is on the end of the lower jaw of a reptile that forms the jaw joint with this bone here that's in red called the quadrate. Here's it, you can look at it here from the inside, this is from the outside, and this then is looking at it from the bottom. Now it's really interesting here because if you see the orange here that says D, that's the dentary. That's the jawbone that we have. And notice that there's a little place on the dentary right here that contacts this blue area, the deep blue. That is the mammalian jaw joint. The red then and the yellow come together and form the reptilian jaw joint. Notice something else here too. This pink bone, it's the colors I had and they showed up. And for those of you who are colorblind, I apologize, but you know, I'm not deliberately discriminating against the majority here. You notice this is part of the jaw joint and it's part of the skull, and it's joined right here. It articulates with the stapes, which is the bone that conducts sound from the eardrum to the inner ear in reptiles. So the angular, and here, the articular, the quadrate, the articular, the quadrate, and the stapes, these 3 together, in this order, will be the 3 ear bones in the mammalian middle ear. This animal chewed and heard and had both jaw joints at the same time. This impossible transitional form, folks, impossible, according to my opponent here, did exist. And it did chew, it did hear. So the creationists have an out. When the data really, really get too tough, when the data destroy their case, a real good out is to say, well, just because it looks like a transitional form doesn't mean it was. Just because all the data point to it, just because the impossible transitional forms that we said couldn't exist did, doesn't mean that it was any sort of an evolutionary ancestor. That's a cop-out. It's a way of avoiding dealing with some really uncomfortable facts. Well, how about some independent evidence then? Everybody here, at one time, when you were an 8-week-old fetus, had a reptilian jaw joint. This is a fetal lower jaw in a human being. This is the relationship of the mandible to the jaw, the relationship of Meckel's cartilage to the jaw at about the age 2 months, 8 weeks. Notice now, Meckel's cartilage, by the way, is the shark's jaw that we got from it. The bone of the lower jaw deposits around Meckel's cartilage. Meckel's cartilage doesn't become a part of the jaw. The bone deposits around it. It simply serves as a template for the formation of the lower jaw. Notice out here at the end of this is the malleus and the incus, 2 of the ear bones in the human being. Here we are, an 8-week-old fetus. Here is Meckel's cartilage, the jaw. Here is the malleus at the end of it. Here is the stapes, or the incus, I mean, and the stapes is down in behind them. Right here, here's the jawbone, here's the joint. The joint is the reptilian jaw joint. Sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but I didn't design this thing. I'm just reporting the facts. 9-week-old infant. Now, here's the jaw. Bone is starting to deposit around Meckel's cartilage. And now you have the malleus and the incus that have separated from the joint. Here's the joint up here now. And here are the malleus and the incus and attached to the stapes. So it has moved, it is simply detached from the jaw and remained attached to the stapes where it was always attached anyway. So it's not any really big deal. It shows our reptilian ancestry. It shows our shark ancestry. Now, the standard creationist response here is to say that nobody accepts these embryological data because Haeckel's law of recapitulation has been rejected. It certainly has, but I'm not talking about Haeckel's recapitulation law. I'm talking about Weismann's biogenetic law, which has very strong support, and I let these facts speak for themselves. This is legitimate evidence for evolution. It is not just some wild, irrelevant thing. It is strong evidence for descent with modification, and it is strong evidence that the creationist claims that these facts don't exist are wrong. They deny that facts are facts. So human fossils and biochemicals disprove the claim of no transitions. You notice now the standard response, the standard tactic to this is you just don't see the details when you read creation science books. You read a lot of quotes, you read a lot of opinions, you don't read details. How long do I have? Forever? Oh boy, 8 minutes, that's forever. They resort often to rhetorical tricks instead of giving you facts. This is a particularly nasty one. I think it's amusing. They challenge evolutionists to show the transition from a cow to a whale. Well, no serious evolution, of course, says that cows gave rise to whales. What the evidence shows is that cows, that is ungulates in general, and whales shared a common ancestor. Why show a cartoon like this when there are facts available, known facts that you can look at for yourselves? This is a part of the cetacean fossil record. Here's a mesonychid on top here, a land-dwelling mammal, had massive teeth, strong jaw. Its teeth were well differentiated for strong chewing. Then the earliest known aquatic form, probably amphibious about 45 million years ago, was a protocetid. Now, Pachycetus, by the way, was found since this was made. It falls right in here, where you would expect it to. But now we have the protocetids. Notice that the brain case has changed. The cheekbone is becoming thinner. The snout is becoming elongated. Whales get their snout up on top of their head. It's not because the snout moves. It's simply because as they develop, the jaw bones grow forward and sort of leave the nares, the nostrils, behind. Okay. Anyway, then the durodontids 40 million years ago, the squalodontids. By the time you get down here to the squalodontids, you notice that most of the teeth have become peg-like dolphins today, It still has, you can't really see it on this slide, I apologize for that, but back in here, it still has nice, sharp, meat-chewing teeth. And then finally, the delphinids, which are the modern dolphins, here and off the bottom there, see all over the flowers on the background. Nostrils on top of the head, the cheekbone is just a sliver, and the teeth have all become peg-like. Now, I presented this last year. Again, Acts and Facts last November accused me of lying, of organizing these things artificially to make it look like evolution. It's a cheap shot. It's not worthy of it. I resent it, and I don't want to see that kind of reference in print again. If you have the facts to disprove what I said here, publish them in Nature. They'd be happy to have them. Okay, another tenet. Change is only within fixed limits of originally created kinds of plants and animals. Now, we run into problems here trying to define what a kind is. Kind is, according to Marsh, an article in Impact and a book, a kinds once shared a common gene pool. And the way you can tell that is if fertilization between the two occurs. So I don't want to show you, and creationism says these were created originally separate. They have to stay totally separate from one another. There is an impenetrable barrier between them. Well, how much variation will you accept as kinds? Here's a pilot whale and a bottlenose dolphin. These two at SeaWorld mated and produced an offspring. It was born dead, but the important thing, remember, according to the Barrowman discussion in Marsh, was fertilization with some subsequent divisions that went on. So these two are the same created kind. And in a few years since creation, they've diverged a little bit. That's just trivial change within kinds, nothing to that. Let's look at a couple of others. Here are cattle, family Bovidae. You're all familiar with cows. Well, it just so happens that cattle and sheep eggs, or cattle will fertilize sheep, cattle sperm will fertilize sheep eggs. And you will get several divisions. It goes on for quite a ways before the developing embryo dies. Cattle and sheep are one created kind. Now, how long after creation did cattle and sheep diverge? You know, it's been less than 10,000 years. No evolutionist anywhere would talk about that kind of rate of evolution. But according to the creation model, this is nothing. Going from cattle to sheep, trivial change within kinds. But there is a barrier between kinds. We don't see any evidence of any kind of barrier like that anywhere. We don't see it when we look at proteins. We don't see it when we look at crossbreeding this way. I would love to see that impenetrable, uncrossable barrier. And what is it that decides what it is when it's sometimes very, very narrow and other times as broad as this? Well, now one other line of evidence, maybe I can get through this. Catastrophism, a worldwide flood. Now every time I do the flood business, I'm always accused of talking about irrelevancies because the flood doesn't really count. According to creationists, however, the flood does really count. I mean, for them to say the flood doesn't count as evidence, if we can show that it didn't happen, that's irrelevant anyway. It's sort of like me saying, well, just because you can show that animals never came from another species, no species ever gave rise to a different kind, that's irrelevant to evolution. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. A walk from the bottom of the Grand Canyon is like a walk from the bottom of the ocean, across the tidal zone, over the shore, across the lowlands, and on to the upland regions. It should reveal first pre-flood rocks with no fossils, deposits with simple ocean dwellers, so on. You get up to the top, because this has all been decided by hydrodynamic assortment, that is how these things settle out according to their relative densities in water, by ecological zonation, by all these organisms that were created together and so they all live together. That's why really we would expect to find, when we look in the fossil record, if there really was creation in a flood, to find a random mixture of species. Maybe an old Volkswagen hubcap or something down in the Devonian. And fleeing to the uplands. The fast guys, the mammals and the birds, they got way up high to get away from those rising floodwaters. Well, here's a Grand Canyon. You walk up, and if you read this thing carefully, you see that worm tracks and trilobite burrows down here, and then primitive fish along here, marine fossils. Now we've gotten up here to the shoreline finally, animal fossils and animal footprints along here. It's easy to see if you come here to the Grand Canyon and you're looking, and you look in these sediments right in here, you'll find things like amphibian tracks. All right, that's what you'd expect. But now let's go on up to the next level, because there's where we expect to find, if the flood is right, mammals and birds. We get up to the Kaibab limestone, the top layer in the Grand Canyon, we find layer after layer after layer. Here's the trail down here to give you an idea of the size of this. Hundreds of feet of one layer after another of marine organisms. Brachiopods, sponges, all kinds of marine bottom organisms. Where the flood says that you should have had fields and forests with birds and mammals in them, hills and so on. One other real problem too, this Grand Canyon is not laid out like just a little walk. It is vertical. The Grand Canyon was cut down through this. This whole Colorado Plateau occupies over 100,000 square miles. And the flood, we're asked to believe, picked up somewhere, ocean bottom, brought it in here, transported how far, set it down, and didn't disturb the footprints and mud cracks and burrows that were in it, and then picked up another layer and laid it in here with these reptile tracks and things in it, on top of a mile of sediments it had already deposited. And then finally, just to top things off, put all these marine fossils up here. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, let's be reasonable. There is no evidence, there's no reasonable way for any kind of a flood to do this if, as my opponents say, it was natural processes, but just bigger. Natural process that picks up 100,000 square miles of mud this big and brings it over and deposits it, you got to be kidding. Well, to say that the flood is not germane then is really ridiculous. Here's all this hundreds of thousands of square miles. It goes way up to Bryce Canyon, and all the deposits in the Grand Canyon continue way over here. You can dig holes, dig wells down there, and you find it. Well, you just have vague, undefined terms. You have no real evidence of any kind. That's where the creationist facts, finally, the Louisiana model, gets it to here, where it has just disintegrated totally. All it says, now it's given up all the tenets, no kinds, no flood, no supernatural creator, just abrupt appearance of the universe and life in complex forms. There's not a leg to stand on. They've reverted essentially to nothing. I think supporters of this should ask, hey, what are we supporting here? What are we giving our support to when this whole thing has disintegrated, maybe in accordance with the second law of thermodynamics, to nothing? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Awbrey. We want to give Dr. Gish just a moment to get set up. Presenting the scientific creationist viewpoint, Dr. Dwayne Gish. Dr. Gish received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from UCLA in 1949 and his doctorate in biochemistry in 1953 from the University of California, Berkeley. He spent 18 years in biomedical research at several institutions, including Cornell University Medical College, the Virus Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Upjohn Company, a pharmaceutical firm in Kalamazoo, Michigan. During that time, he worked with 2 Nobel Prize winners and is the author or co-author of over 30 technical papers. He has authored several books and has published numerous papers on the subject of creation versus evolution. He has lectured and debated on this subject on major university campuses throughout the United States and over 20 foreign countries. He is the Vice President of the Institute for Creation Research. Let's welcome Dr. Dwayne Gish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Awbrey, ladies and gentlemen, certainly it's my privilege to have this opportunity this evening to present the scientific case for creation. Now, there are 2 basic views concerning origins, I'm sure you appreciate. Evolution theory postulates a mechanistic, naturalistic, evolutionary process of self-transformation, beginning with a hypothetical explosion of a hypothetical cosmic egg derived from some unknown source by an unknown and unknowable process. This hypothetical Big Bang supposedly generated hydrogen gas, which expanded out into the vast stretches of the universe. Now, I want you to understand that that time, some billions of years ago, no one really knows how long ago, according to the evolutionists, but some billions of years ago, at that time, the only thing that existed in this entire universe was hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas was the universe. And it is from this hydrogen gas, then, everything in the universe created itself. Stars created themselves, galaxies created themselves, our solar system created itself, life arose spontaneously on this planet, and all living things, including man, then evolved or arose from that first form of life. Thus, everything in the universe, according to the evolution theory, everything in the universe, including man, with his 30 trillion cells of over 200 varieties, and including his 12 billion brain cells, with somewhere between 100 trillion and 1 quadrillion connections in this human brain, this is all the product of this primordial hydrogen gas. According to this theory, then hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. Now, that is precisely what evolutionists believe. I think it's rather amusing myself. Fact is, as a scientist, I consider the notion incredible. But this is what they have to believe, since billions of years ago there was nothing but hydrogen gas, and here we are today. So we've come from hydrogen gas. Now, the creation scientist says, no. In view of known natural laws and processes, including the laws of thermodynamics, chemical kinetics, the laws of probability, the universe could not have created itself naturally, and life could not have arisen spontaneously on this planet. Now, if the universe and life could not have created themselves naturally, then they had to be created supernaturally. The creation scientist thus maintains that the stars, the galaxies, our solar system, and each basic type of plant and animal, including man, that is what we would call the created kind, the basic type or basic morphological design, each were supernaturally created. Thus, these two theories contrast a non-theistic, mechanistic, naturalistic process to a theistic, supernatural, spatial creation process for the origin of the universe and all living things. These are the two basic models of origins which we are discussing and debating here this evening. Harlow Shapley, the late Professor Harlow Shapley, professor at Harvard University, once said that some people piously proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen. And so he believed, in essence, that hydrogen was his creator. Since obviously there was nothing in the beginning but hydrogen gas, then it was hydrogen gas and not God who created everything. Now, actually, the age of the earth is not an issue here this evening. We have some very definite ideas on the age of the earth, but that's not the issue. The issue is not when this universe came into existence, but how. The when problem, I think, is an important question, but not the question we are discussing this evening. I really don't care, basically, as far as this creation evolution question is concerned, whether the earth is 10,000 years old or 10 billion years old. The evidence demands creation. Now, let us dispense once and for all with this twisted notion that evolution is a scientific theory while creation is purely a religious concept. A scientific theory can be concerned only with the here and now. Now, you can have theories about anything, and I suppose science can be used to mean anything. Science maybe you define science as what a scientist is doing when he's thinking. Maybe that's what you call science. But that is not what you call a scientific theory. A scientific theory, or a theory to be scientific, must fulfill certain rigid criteria. A scientific theory is our attempt to explain, to understand and explain the operation of the universe and the operation of living things. For example, theories concerning the orbits of comets, the generation of energy in the sun, the reproduction, the development, and the biochemistry of living organisms, for example, theories about things like that are scientific theories. They're dealing with the here and now, with processes that are going on right now. We can construct testable scientific theories about events of that kind. These theories then evolve processes, events, and properties which are repeatedly observable. However, quite obviously, there were no human observers to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of life. As a matter of fact, there were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. These events were unique. They occurred only once and in the unobservable past. No one has ever seen anything created, and no one has ever seen anything evolve. And you cannot go into the laboratory and test a theory, for example, how a fish may have evolved into an amphibian, or how this universe may have formed. There's no way to do that. Neither creation nor evolution, strictly speaking then, is a scientific theory. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidences. That circumstantial evidence is available, and we can test or compare the creation concept to this evidence and try to infer what happened in the past. We can do the same thing with evolution. Creation and evolution are equally scientific, and they are equally non-religious. We all have a certain particular worldview. The evolutionist has his. He says everything must be explained naturally. Now that's okay as far as the operation of things are concerned. Certainly in my work as a biochemist, I assume what I saw happening today happened yesterday and would happen in the future. That does not exclude the possibility of a miracle or supernatural intervention, but we must assume as scientists that things always operate in the same way when we try to explain the operation of the universe or the operation of living things. Of course, that's the way I operated as a biochemist. But now the evolutionist goes beyond that. He not only insists that we must explain the operation of the universe and its living things through the natural laws and natural processes that are now operating, but he assumed that the origin of the universe and the origin of life and the origin of living things must be and can be explained utilizing nothing more but those same natural laws and natural processes. And this is what we deny. Now, how are we going to choose between the two? Well, let's just go out there in the real world and just take a look and see what's going on. Now, the evolutionist says the processes by which life came into existence are still operating today. Therefore, his theories on the origin of life and on evolution, of course, must not contradict what we see out there in the real world. They must agree. Let's take a look at that notion. Is it possible? Can we explain the incredibly complex living organisms on the basis of chance, on the basis of ordinary chance processes of chemistry and physics? And of course, it was strictly chance. There's no creator, there's no intelligence, there's no purpose. It just happened. Therefore, it just had to happen, you see, according to the laws of chemistry and physics. Well, let's take a look at that notion. Here on this slide, we have a structure of an enzyme. Now, enzymes are absolutely necessary for life. You could have nothing living without enzymes. They catalyze chemical reactions so that they go very rapidly, which ordinarily would go very slowly. You cannot have life without enzymes, and the most primitive form of life imaginable would have to have hundreds of different kinds of enzymes in order to accomplish all of these tasks necessary for life. And in addition to hundreds of different kinds of enzymes, you'd have to have hundreds, maybe thousands of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules, which are even more complex. Now let's try to consider the origin of one single protein molecule. Here we have ribonuclease. It's a rather small protein. The average protein has 400 amino acids. This only has 124. Now, in proteins today, there are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and they are all left-handed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just let me say very briefly that on the hypothetical primordial Earth, you'd have two kinds of each amino acid. You'd have a left-handed one and a right-handed one. Chemically, you produce equal quantities. They would be equally numerous on the Earth, equally abundant. But today, every protein, without exception, has 100% left-handed amino acid. Chemistry doesn't make a choice. There's no difference. How, then, is it that proteins today are 100% left-handed when chemistry could not possibly make that choice? It seems to be the result of deliberate choice by an intelligent creator. But let's make it easy for the evolutionists. Let's say that on the hypothetical primordial Earth, we only had 20 different kinds of amino acids instead of the hundreds that would be supposedly possible. Let us suppose they're all left-handed. Now, what's the probability that just by the chance the actions of chemistry and physics, we'd get something like this? Well, in order to have this enzyme, ribonuclease, we've got to have lysine, number one, then glutamic acid, then threonine, alanine, lysine, phenylalanine, glutamic acid, arginine, glutamine, so forth and so on. 124 amino acids arranged in precise order. Well, you can do some shuffling around, but not much. Now, we've got to get those things arranged in that order in order to have that particular enzyme. Well, what's the probability? Well, the probability lysine will be number one, of course, is 1 out of 20. Not bad. But now, if you have lysine number one, glutamic acid number two, that's 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 1 out of 400. What about the first three? Lysine, glutamic acid, threonine, 1 over 20 times itself three times. That's 1 out of 8,000. What about 4? 1 out of 160,000. What about the first 5? 1 out of 3,200,000. What about the first 124? What is the probability that you're going to get those amino acids arranged in that order in order to have this enzyme? 1 over 20 multiplied times itself 124 times. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that number is so enormous that it's incomprehensible. That is, the probability that those amino acids would by chance just happen to get arranged in that order is so incredibly low, it is essentially zero. Let me illustrate the probability of getting those 124 amino acids, 20 kinds, in that order, by chance. Let's just take the visible universe. That's the largest thing we know much about. Let's take it and just jam-pack it solid with electrons so there's not a cubic inch of space left over. We've filled the universe absolutely solid with electrons. And then we go out in the universe and put your name on one of those electrons. And we tell you to go out in the universe and find the electron with your name on it. By the time you found that electron with your name on it, we will have arranged these 124 amino acids by chance, making 1,000,000 tries a second. Well, you could hunt for trillions times trillions of years and never have the slightest probability of ever finding the electron with your name on it. That's the probability of getting this one particular enzyme. But supposing by some miracle it did happen, what would you have? One single molecule of one single protein. But we've got an ocean containing 350 million cubic miles of water. We've got to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules, hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules and others, even to have a ghost of a chance of getting life started. What is the probability that's going to happen by chance, by the ordinary processes of chemistry and physics? Ladies and gentlemen, it's never going to happen. Never. It could not happen. And I don't care. I'll give you every protein you can think of. I'll give you every DNA and RNA molecule you can think of in any quantity you can think of, and you will still not get a living organism. You see, in order to have life, you've got to have more than just a bag of chemicals. You've got to have a very highly complex organized structure. Living organisms have a very, very complex membrane, incredibly complex. They've got to have protein factories, energy factories. They've got to have the genetic material. And all of this has to be put together in just a certain way. And it just had to happen spontaneously. These molecules just had to decide, hey, let's get together. We're just floating around here and there's no meaning, it's no purpose, and life needs to be formed. Now let's get together and start cooperating. And make a membrane and make energy factories and all of that. Why, that's nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, matter doesn't do that. The universal natural tendency is for things to become disorganized. The universal natural tendency, it's so universal, it's called the natural law, the second law of thermodynamics, tells us that the natural tendency of everything is to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. And here we got to go against that natural law and form something that is so indescribably complex. I'm convinced that if man could study life forever, there would still be much about it we would never understand. Now, the evolutionists have us to believe that these things just somehow, by natural processes, created themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not science. That's 20th century mythology. That's a nature myth and nothing more. Here's a newspaper article that appeared in a London newspaper, August 14th, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. I didn't realize that was quite such an amazing conclusion, but it was to these two scientists because when they began their studies, they were both atheists. Now, I want you to understand, I'm not implying that all evolutionists are atheists. As a matter of fact, most are not. But these two were. They wouldn't have any bias towards our point of view. Who were these two scientists? Sir Fred Hoyle, famous British astronomer, if not the world's foremost astronomer, then certainly one of the world's foremost astronomers, and his friend and colleague, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, also a very well-known British astronomer. They got interested in this problem, the origin of life, and they began by making certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started on this earth. Then they calculated the probability of this primitive form of life evolving in 5 billion years on our planet. The probability, one chance out of the number one followed by 40,000 zeros. Ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you, that is just flatly zero. And so they said, obviously life has not evolved on this planet, but after all, there's 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy contains 100 billion stars. Let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let's calculate the probability that life evolved somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low, so slight, they said that essentially the probability was zero. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, I always tell evolutionists, if you want to believe that, that's okay, but don't call it science. It's nothing but a myth. Anybody who could believe such a thing. Sir Fred Hoyle and Professor Wickramasinghe are not Bible-believing Christians, not at all. But they do believe that wherever life exists in this universe, it had to be created. They said they could find no logical way out of it. It was our science that convinced them. Did they become scientists because of their religion? Obviously not. They became creationists in spite of their religion, you see. It was the compelling nature of their scientific evidence. At least their minds were open. They were objective enough to accept the scientific evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, life did not come into existence on this planet by any natural process. It is absolutely impossible. There is only one alternative, and that's the alternative, quite logically, that Hoyle accepted. Life had to be supernaturally created. Now let us leave this matter, and we could go on and on and on and talk about many, many things. that demands deliberate, intelligent creation, gives evidence for design and purpose. Multitude of examples. But let's leave this now and consider the fossil record. The fossil record is the history of life, the only history of life that we have out there in the world. If evolution is true, then obviously the fossil record would establish that fact. But you know, Darwin knew that the fossil record was an embarrassment to his theory. He knew that. He acknowledged that fact. He knew that the rocks refused to yield the transitional forms required by his theory. He hoped, however, that future discoveries would produce the intermediate forms required by his theory. Well, we're 125 years after Darwin, ladies and gentlemen. Evolutionists have searched intensely for these intermediate forms, but the missing links are still missing. In our museums today, we have 250,000 different fossil species represented by tens of millions of cataloged fossils. No one can any longer plead the poverty of the fossil record, as Darwin did. We have an immensely rich fossil record. If evolution is true, there wouldn't be any question about it. There wouldn't be any debate. I wouldn't be here tonight. Dr. Awbrey wouldn't be here tonight. We'd all be evolutionists. It should be so obvious, there'd be no question. There'd be no problem whatsoever. Ladies and gentlemen, we have billions times billions of fossil potential. We have millions of cataloged fossils. Tremendous sampling of the fossil record, and that fossil record, of course, must show what evolution would predict. What would evolution predict? Well, we started with a little microscopic single-cell organism, and this little microscopic creature gradually and slowly during hundreds of millions of years has evolved into everything living today. There be all of these vast number of intermediate stages as the microscopic single-cell organisms evolved into complex invertebrates, which we'll see shortly. And then the invertebrate would have gradually, during 100 million years, evolutionists believe, evolved into a fish, which is a vertebrate. And then the fish gradually changed into an amphibian as fins change into feet and legs. And the amphibian changes into a reptile, reptiles into birds, scales change into feathers, forelimbs into wings. On up the scale, and finally an ape gradually changes into man. That's what we'd expect if evolution is true. The creationists would expect something very, very differently. He would expect that the fossils of each one of the basic types of plants and animals, basic morphological designs, each one of these created types would appear fully formed right from the start. There would be no evidence via intermediate forms that these basic types have arisen from a common ancestor. Right from the start, a sponge would be a sponge, a fish would be a fish, an onion would be an onion, a tiger would be a tiger, and people would be people. That's what we'd expect. Well, what does the fossil record actually show, ladies and gentlemen? Well, more and more evolutionists are beginning to acknowledge that there is little or no evidence in the fossil record for gradual change. An article published in Newsweek, for example, November 3rd, 1980. I just use this to show that this information, the trade secret of paleontology, as mentioned by Stephen Jay Gould, famous evolutionist, he said this is a trade secret of paleontology. It's no longer a trade secret. It's getting into the popular press. This absence of transitional form. An article published in Newsweek, November 3rd, 1980, states, and I quote, "The missing link between man and the apes is merely the most glamorous of a whole hierarchy of phantom creatures." End of quote. Now, let me just pause here a moment to say, they are characterizing these transitional forms as phantom creatures. Now, what are phantom creatures? That's something nobody ever sees. You know, the will o' the wisp, you try to put your hands on it, you can't do it. That's what these things are, according to the article. These transitional forms demanded by the theory of evolution, they are just phantom creatures. The article goes on to say, the more scientists have searched for the transitional forms that lie between species, the more they have been frustrated. Now, I'm going to quote from a couple of evolutionists as to the general nature of the fossil record to show that while I am going to, of course, show selected examples, all examples are selected, yet what I'm going to show you by example is characterizes the general nature of that fossil record. Dr. David Kitts, professor at the University of Oklahoma, is a geologist, got his training in vertebrate paleontology under George Gaylord Simpson. Certainly he's very, very aware of the fossil record. That's his specialty. He's one of the two evolutionists that Dr. Morris and I debated on that campus a number of years ago. And during the debate, Dr. Kitts turned to us on the stage and said, well, he says the gaps are real, and they are a problem. A couple of years after that debate, Dr. Kitts published an article in the journal Evolution. That's volume 28, 1974. And he was discussing the relationship of the fossil record to evolution theory. So this is perfectly in context. He was talking about the gaps, the absence of transitional form. And this is what he had to say. Dr. Kitts says, and I quote, "Despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them." End of quote. In other words, Dr. Kitts says evolution requires these intermediate forms, demands these intermediate forms, but the fossil record does not produce them. Why then is Dr. Kitts an evolutionist? Not because of the scientific evidence, quite obviously, but in spite of the scientific evidence. Now, Dr. E.J.H. Corner is the botanist at Cambridge University. He is an evolutionist. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he does believe that plants have evolved. But he had a chapter called Evolution in a book published in 1961. Now, let me assure you, the fossil record of plants has not changed since that time. This nature, basic nature that he refers to is the same today as it was 25 years ago. Evolution has been searching for those transition points for 125 years, ladies and gentlemen. And in this book, Dr. Corner says, and I quote, and it's taken from the book Contemporary Botanical Thought, and he says, and I quote, "Much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution." By the way, ladies and gentlemen, if we want to quote out of context, if we want to try to color things to our point of view, I would leave that statement out. But I'm going to give you the complete statement, his belief. Quote, "Much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, but I still think that, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, are you unprejudiced? Are you free of any preconceived notions? No, no one is. But Dr. Corner says if you were, you would have to acknowledge the fact that the fossil record of plants favors creation, not evolution. Now, he says that because every one of the major plant kinds have appeared abruptly fully formed. The flowering plant, for example, 43 families of flowering plants suddenly appear. There's no intermediate showing where these flowering plants came from. Now, let's take a look at some of the other evidence. Here are reconstruction of animals found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Now, evolutionists believe these Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago, and they formed during about 100 million years. Now, I must say, I don't have the slightest notion how you get fossils under conditions like that. Sediment just slowly settles out of the water and gradually covers up these things, and you get fossils. No, you don't get fossils that way. To get fossils, they have to be buried. These creatures have to be buried, and have to be buried very rapidly, or they're completely gone. If animals just die and lie out on the ground, float around the water, everything disappears. Oxidation, scavengers, bacterial decomposition, and other processes completely destroy the creatures. Here we have billions, times billions of these creatures. Massive fossil graveyards. How they ever formed by any slow, gradual process, I don't have the foggiest notion. But here they are, and their presence demands an explanation. In these Cambrian rocks, we find, for example, jellyfish, sponges, sea urchins, trilobites, swimming crustacean Sydnea, sea lilies, brachiopods, worms, starfishes, a great variety of very highly complex invertebrates. These are not simple. These are so complex, evolutionists believe their evolution required 2 to 3 billion years. Now, underneath the Cambrian rocks, we have what are simply called Precambrian rocks. Now, many of these Precambrian rocks are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. If the fossils were there, they certainly should be found. Now, if evolution is true, if life started with a little microscopic single-cell creature which gradually evolved into this great array of very complex creatures, then the Precambrian rocks must contain the ancestors of these creatures. What do we find in Precambrian rocks? Let me tell you, first of all, what we don't find. Nowhere on the face of this earth have we found an ancestor for a single one of those creatures. Right from the start, a jellyfish is a jellyfish, a worm is a worm, a brachiopod is a brachiopod, a sea urchin is a sea urchin, a trilobite is a trilobite. Wherever you find them and whenever they occurred on this earth, they were fully formed right from the start. Now, in the Precambrian rocks, there are now in the scientific literature many reports of fossils of little microscopic, single-cell, soft-bodied bacteria and algae. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you can find a fossil of a little single-cell, microscopic, soft-bodied bacteria, you could certainly find fossils of everything between that creature and these creatures, obviously. We've never found one such intermediate form. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is beyond dispute. This is beyond question. Stephen Jay Gould, in a paper just a year or two ago, said it's true. We have never yet found the ancestors of these creatures. Ladies and gentlemen, that settles the question. The debate is over with. We can go home. Evolution has not taken place. It is obvious it has not taken place. Why should I argue with Dr. Awbrey about the so-called mammal-like reptiles or Australopithecus or Archaeopteryx or anything like that? Why argue about that when his fellow evolutionists will argue with him about it? Here is a place where there is no question, where there is no dispute, where no one would doubt this immense gap of several billion years on an evolutionary time scale and not one single intermediate form. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is beyond dispute. This is beyond question. Stephen Jay Gould, in a paper just a year or two ago, said it's true. We have never yet found the ancestors of these creatures. Ladies and gentlemen, that settles the question. The debate is over with. We can go home. Evolution has not taken place. It is obvious it has not taken place. Why should I argue with Dr. Awbrey about the so-called mammal-like reptiles or Australopithecus or Archaeopteryx or anything like that? Why argue about that when his fellow evolutionists will argue with him about it? Here is a place where there is no question, where there is no dispute, where no one would doubt this immense gap of several billion years on an evolutionary time scale and not one single intermediate form. And we have this immediately followed by another immense gap. Ladies and gentlemen, supposedly one of these creatures evolved into fishes. Now, these were invertebrates. They either soft-bodied, such as jellyfish or worms, or they had a hard outer part or shell, or a soft inner part. They are invertebrates. Supposedly one of these creatures evolved into a fish. Now, a fish is a vertebrate like you and I. It has an internal skeleton, has a backbone. Tremendously different. And if one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish during 100 million years, then we ought to have the intermediate form. Now, I want to emphasize this huge gap between the single-cell creatures and the invertebrates. There's what we have, ladies and gentlemen, fossils of the microscopic single-cell creatures, fossils of those complex invertebrates, and not one single intermediate, in spite of the assumed billions of years of evolution. Now, here we have some of the invertebrates, and there's the fish. Now, I'm not saying that evolution believes necessarily that one of those invertebrates evolved into a fish, but at one time or another, one evolutionist or another has chosen every invertebrate in existence as the ancestor of fishes. Now, suppose that one of those things evolved into fishes. Billions times billions times billions of the intermediates would have lived and died during that 100 million years. Our museum should be overflowing with thousands upon thousands and thousands of the undoubted intermediates showing what invertebrate evolved into fishes and what the intermediate forms look like. Ladies and gentlemen, we've never found a trace of an intermediate form. Not one. Now, you can believe, if you wish, that fishes evolved from some invertebrate, but you've just got to believe it. The empirical scientific evidence shows that there are absolutely no intermediates. And again, ladies and gentlemen, that's beyond question. That's not a subject of dispute. Is it even possible to imagine what the necessary intermediates would have looked like? Let us suppose that evolution is taking place. Could you imagine what the intermediates, let's say, between a starfish and a fish would have looked like, or an intermediate between a worm and a fish? Could you sit down and sketch out these intermediates? In an article published in Natural History, volume 86, 1977, page 22, Dr. Gould stated, and I quote, "Even though we have no direct evidence for smooth transitions, can we invent a reasonable sequence of intermediate forms, that is, viable, functioning organisms between ancestors and descendants? Of what possible use are the imperfect, incipient stages of useful structures? What good is half a jaw or half a wing?" End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that statement in itself is not rather surprising. I mean, creationists have been saying that ever since Darwin. But what is incredible, it is now being said by an evolutionist like Stephen Jay Gould. Indeed, what good is a half a jaw or half a wing? Therefore, we have to go from no jaw to a jaw and from no wing to a wing. And we come up with Dr. Goldschmidt's hopeful monster mechanism, where he said a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. And that's why there are no intermediate forms. It's been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile. Well, the people who believe in slow and gradual evolution believe that Goldschmidt's the one who laid the egg. And they said there's no evidence for such a thing happening. But Goldschmidt said there's no transitional forms. There's no transitional forms between reptiles and birds. Therefore, a reptile must have laid out an egg and a bird hatched from the egg, you see. Well, I'm sorry. Dr. Awbrey stole some of my thunder here tonight, showed one of my slides. A friend of mine tried to visualize something like this. Luther Sunderland, a very fine creation scientist back in New York. You see, evolutionists say, and this is an article in National Geographic magazine, December 1976, and also in Scientific American, March of 1979. These evolutionists said that some hairy, four-legged mammal in search of food or sanctuary ventured into the water. And then over eons of time, this creature slowly and gradually evolved into a whale. As the tail changed into flukes, the hind legs gradually disappeared, and the front legs changed into flippers. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not what I said. That's what an evolutionist said. Now you try to imagine what those intermediates look like. One of them said that it might have resembled a cow, a pig, or a buffalo. That is, the ancestor may have resembled. I didn't say it was a cow or a pig or a buffalo, but it may have resembled a cow or pig or buffalo. And so, as Dr. Awbrey showed, here's what my friend came up with as he tried to visualize this. The cow ventured into water, the tail changed into flukes, the hind legs disappeared, and the front legs changed into flippers. If I suppose if we had a failure here, we just called it an utter failure. But fortunately, everything went according to clockwork. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as Dr. Awbrey has already pointed out, this is just a caricature. Yes, it's just a caricature. But I would like to, first of all, some evolution explain how that ancestor managed to get into the water and survive for eons of time as all of these changes gradually took place and the whale finally existed with its very specialized hearing apparatus and very spatial construction whereby it can dive down to hundreds and hundreds of feet and the The mother whale has muscles on her mammary gland so she can express the milk very, very rapidly into the mouth of the baby whale, otherwise the poor little fellow just drowned. How in the world did whales manage to survive until she evolved those spatial muscles? The poor little fellows would just all drown, you see. Now, Dr. Awbrey showed some slides of some supposed creatures, but if you could read carefully, and I may show the same slide later, the first creature was a land animal with specialized teeth, incisors, canine, premolars, and molars. The next creature, the Protocetidae, the slide right there said it was a wholly aquatic form, and its teeth were totally undifferentiated, just simple pegs. There's no intermediate form there. You've got to go from those very specialized teeth to the very unspecialized teeth of whales and dolphins and things like that. And there were no intermediate forms there whatsoever. And no one can even imagine what these intermediates would have looked like. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to discuss this matter of human organs. It's not necessary. I mean the gaps between the microscopic organism and those complex invertebrates, the gap supposedly of billions of years. And the gap between the invertebrate and the fish is another gap of supposedly 100 million years. There's absolutely no transitional form. There's not even a suggestion of one. There's no question, no dispute. Why even talk about anything else? Well, because everybody's interested in the subject. So I want to take a look at this. Here we have the idea, the evolutionist idea. We start with some ape-like creature, gradually becomes man. Now, it took several million years, and so he's been looking for the intermediate form. Now here is the central figure in human evolutionary schemes, Australopithecus. First found in Africa, South Africa, 1924. Others have been found since. This is a skull found by Dr. Louis Leakey and wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. You see that it certainly was an ape. Had this sagittal crest, the bony ridge across the top of the skull, had no forehead. The head totally flat, massive eyebrow ridges, massive jaws, massive teeth, grossly ape-like. But the claim is that the teeth are somewhat man-like. And later it was claimed that these creatures walked upright. Now, more recently, Donald Johanson has found a series of fossils in Ethiopia to which he gave the name Australopithecus afarensis. One of these was of a female, about 40% complete. He called it Lucy. And he claimed that although Lucy was ape from the neck up, she had the jaws, the teeth, the face, and the brain of an ape. Nevertheless, she walked upright in the human manner. So there we have something intermediate, you see, something in between man and the ape. And that is what most people believe. That's what you read in your textbooks, what you see in National Geographic, what you see on television. But not everyone believes it. And these people, some who do not believe it, are not creationists. They are evolutionists. They have certainly done their homework. They've studied these creatures for many, many years. One of these scientists is Lord Zuckerman. And one other one of these scientists is Dr. Charles Oxnard. Now, it's true that Lord Zuckerman never studied Lucy. But ladies and gentlemen, he studied fossils of Australopithecus that are supposed to be 1 to 2 million years younger or more recent than Lucy. Therefore, if anything, they would be more man-like, more upright, more on the way to becoming man. What are the conclusions of Lord Zuckerman? He had a scientific team that studied these creatures for 15 years. He used the most sophisticated methods of analysis available, not burdened by my preconceived notions of creation and so forth, but a prejudice towards the evolutionary point of view. What did he conclude? These creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate between ape and man, and they certainly are not the ancestors of man. Dr. Charles Oxnard, one of his former students, now professor at the University of Southern California, director of their graduate studies. He studied particularly the postcranial skeleton of these creatures for many years, the knee joints, the pelvis, and other structures, using the best methods we have today. What did he conclude? They are not intermediate between ape and man. They did not walk upright like man at all. And he says they are not ancestral to man. And he refers some of his studies to Lucy herself and some other work that's been done. Now, this is supposed to be the central figure in human evolutionary studies, and you see that Dr. Awbrey made it as one of his evidences. Here are several scientists who are not creationists, who certainly have done tremendous amount of research, concluded these creatures are not intermediate and not ancestral to man. But could it be that all those scientists out there are wrong? Could they have misread the evidence? Well, it's been done in the past, but before I look at some of that evidence, I want to take a look at two different versions of Australopithecus. This is of Dr. Louis Leakey's skull, that is reconstruction based upon his skull. Here's a reconstruction done by Neve Parker for Dr. Leakey, and look, he has a human nose, a human nose and a human ear, and the eyes of a philosopher, and surely he must be on his way to becoming man. But look at this, look at this. This was a drawing for Dr. Oakley. This is another evolutionist. This was his idea what the creature looked like. Well, what do these things mean? They don't mean a thing, do they? It's totally dependent upon the imagination of the evolutionists. Now let's take a look at the track record of evolutionists in here. Here's Piltdown Man, reconstructed on the basis of a few fossils collected from a gravel pit in England in 1912 near Piltdown. And this was said to be tremendous evidence for human evolution. For nearly a half a century, Piltdown Man, by the consensus of the world's greatest authorities, was our ancestor. Until 1950, he was shown to be a hoax, a fraud. Somebody taking a jawbone of a modern ape, a human skull, had doctored them up with chemicals to make them look old, filed the teeth to make them look man-like, planted them in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. Why did the fraud succeed? Because this is what they thought they ought to find, is what they wanted to find, you see. Now, in 1922, a single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska and created a great deal of excitement. Some of the leading evolutionists in the United States said that this tooth had characteristics intermediate between ape and man. The only question was whether it was an ape-like man or a man-like ape. 1922, the Illustrated London News published a picture of this so-called Nebraska man. Here we see the man, we see his wife, we see the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of that creature. He turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. That's right, it was a pig's tooth. Ladies and gentlemen, Nebraska man was presented as evidence for evolution in the 1920s. Turned out to be nothing more than a pig's tooth. You see, the evolutionists were seeing something that wasn't there because they wanted to see it because they expected to see it. And then this is the early version of Neanderthal man. For 100 years, Neanderthal people were portrayed as these primitives, subhuman, long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged, subhuman. Homo neanderthalensis. Well, it turned out that all of these so-called primitive features were due to pathological conditions, due to arthritis, due to rickets, a vitamin D deficiency, which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. And they've concluded that Neanderthal man was really Homo sapiens. This is a modern version of Neanderthal man obtained from the American Museum of Natural History. And they said about 25 years ago, a couple of evolutionists published an article about Neanderthal and said, now really, if you just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit and place him on a New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 25 years ago, and of course today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? Some circles here in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath, and he'd fit in very nicely. Now, here's another example. Here's a creature. This is the picture I took down here in the Museum of Man of Ramapithecus, portrayed as an intermediate between ape and man. And there you see him, ladies and gentlemen, in the flesh. Well, recent evidence has shown that Ramapithecus was an orangutan. Dr. Alan Walker, John Hopkins University, said that the orangutan, the living orangutan, is a living fossil because he's the same as the fossil they found supposedly 17 million years old. Well, Ramapithecus was not our ancestor, he was just an orangutan. Neanderthal man was not our ancestor, he was man. Piltdown man was not our ancestor, it's a combination of ape's jaw and a human skull. The Nebraska man was not our ancestor, nothing but a pig's tooth. Now that's a pretty sorry record here, ladies and gentlemen. You can stick an ancestor up that family tree, pretty slippery tree, just kicked out, or he just slips down out of the tree. And given a few more years, that's what's going to happen to these other creatures. Now, Lord Zuckerman certainly has done his homework. He was a very careful and objective scientist. He published a book in 1970 called Beyond the Ivory Tower. In that book, he had 2 chapters concerning the search for man's fossil ancestry. And he gave his final conclusion in that book on page 64. Notice what he said. Lord Zuckerman said, "No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation." End of quote. This evolutionist, this expert on primates, said that if we exclude the possibility of creation, then obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there is absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. Is that what Dr. Awbrey told you? Is that what you read in your textbooks? Is that what you see in National Geographic? Is that what you see on television? Well, I should say not. But that was a considered judgment of this objective scientist who is an evolutionist, has no predisposition to accept our point of view. He says there is no evidence in the fossil record that man has evolved. And I certainly think that is true. Some of my ancestors may have hung by the neck, but I don't believe any of them ever hung by the tail. I think each had been separately created, ape, monkey, and man. Now the evolutionist says, well, we can give up on fossils. You know, I debated there not long ago Dr. Vincent Sarich, professor of anthropology, University of California at Berkeley. He says, I don't even want to talk about the fossil record. It's just not relevant. We just don't have enough fossils. The fossil record is just so scanty. It just doesn't tell us anything about evolution. Well, that's not what you heard from Dr. Awbrey tonight, is it? It's not what you hear from evolutionists ordinarily, but that's what he said. Well, forget about the fossil record. We don't need the fossil record. Why? Well, we got molecules. We've got biochemistry to give us evidence for evolution. Well, let's take a look. Here's what the evolutionist tells us. This is his evidence from molecules. He says, certainly Dr. Awbrey would agree with this, that there's very small genetic difference between man and chimpanzee. Just about 1.6% difference in genetics. Now, ladies and gentlemen, really, the difference in genetics is between the genes that code for proteins. I agree, our biochemistry is very similar to chimpanzees and all other living creatures, as a matter of fact. How else could it be? We're living in the same world, we're eating the same food, we're drinking the same water and breathing the same air. Our biochemistry has to be similar because the chemicals in plants must be similar to the chemicals in animals, and the chemicals in animals must be similar to those in humans. Otherwise, the only thing we could eat would be each other. We couldn't eat plants and we couldn't eat animals. Therefore, of course, our biochemistry must be similar to that of all other animals and all other plants, because the chemistry must be similar or we couldn't eat these things, you see. So there is a similarity, but the evolutionist points out something like this. There's 1.6 difference here. There's 1.1 and 3, that's 1.4, and 0.8, that's 2.4. So there's a greater difference, and there's quite a difference between man and the spider monkey and so forth. Now here is the actual data. The differences between man and chimpanzee, between a chimp and a gorilla, between man and an orang, between man and a gibbon and so forth. Those are measurable differences. Then he draws in all of this with these imaginary molecules. But he doesn't have fossil molecules. No one has ever found such a molecule. That is all imaginary. Here is what we actually have. But he constructs something like this. And he says that proves evolution. Well, Dr. Michael Denton, I have his book with me. Dr. Michael Denton is a molecular biologist. He's not a creationist. He has 2 earned doctorates. He's in genetic research. And he has published a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. This non-creationist says on the basis of every count, evolution strikes out. And particularly on the basis of the molecular data. He points out, for example, if we look at hemoglobin, which is a protein, the differences are essentially the same. Now, if you see the frog is an amphibian and was intermediate between the fish and the mammal, then there should be less difference here than here. But actually there's less differences between the lamprey and the human than between the lamprey and the frog. That is not what evolution would predict at all, you see. And then if we look at the differences between a cytochrome C, here's another key protein. There's no intermediates there at all. Nothing like that shows up. And if we look at the percent difference in hemoglobin between the mollusk and the fish, between the mollusk and the frog or amphibian, between the mollusk and a bird, or between the mollusk and the marsupial, no difference, no intermediates. Now, what Dr. Denton has pointed out, ladies and gentlemen, this shows that there are no intermediate, no gradual change of one into the other. Well, I want to show you a bit more. We can do that in the rebuttal. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see then in the matter of the origin of life, what we see in the fossil record, these massive discontinuities, what we see here in the molecular data, these massive discontinuities, we do not see a continuum. Evolution requires a continuum. We find differences and gaps. Ladies and gentlemen, I maintain that is tremendous evidence for creation. Now, the late Professor Harlow Shapley gave us a choice. Either in the beginning God or in the beginning hydrogen. I maintain on the basis of all of the scientific evidence, this scientific evidence demands in the beginning God. Thank you very much.
We want to enter into a series of rebuttals right now. The first of all, which will be presented by Dr. Awbrey for 15 minutes. Right after him, Dr. Gish will come up for 15 minutes. Then followed by Dr. Awbrey one more time for 5 minutes, and by Dr. Gish one more time for 5 minutes, at which time then we will go into the question and answer series for the remainder of the evening. Right now, Dr. Awbrey.
The first thing Dr. Gish talked about was the laws of probability. Now, the laws of probability that he gives you about the formation of a protein are a straw man, because his assumptions don't match what we know. He assumes that a protein will only work, can only function if it's at least 140 or so amino acids long, that every amino acid in that protein has to be exactly where it is, and that there is no chance that any original organism could have been less complex than any living organism today. But some of the things we know, extremely important molecules like porphyrins, which catalyze biological reactions almost as well as a complete molecule that they're tied up with, is when they have long proteins stuck onto them, occur in carbonaceous meteorites. They form spontaneously in space. Active enzymes can be as little as 6 amino acids long. And these big, long amino acid chains that he showed you, proteins, are built up out of simple substructures called domains. And they're just repeats of these domains. So don't get the idea that the laws of probability are what he says they are. I mean, his probability calculations are right, but his assumptions are wrong. And like any calculation, if your assumptions are wrong, you may get a number out at the end, but that number doesn't mean anything. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, I'm really amazed that he used Wickramasinghe, because at the Arkansas trial, Wickramasinghe made it perfectly clear that he is not a creationist. He's at best a theistic evolutionist. His comment when the judge asked him What about scientific creationism was claptrap. He's a theistic evolutionist. Don't use him to support you. He also tells people that insects are intelligent, but they're not telling us. He and Hoyle are arguing that life evolves spontaneously in space and that new diseases, new viruses, crop up on Earth because as we're going through space, we run into these things and they're raining down onto us. I really don't think these people's ideas have very much to do with science. Now, on the question of fossils and fossil intermediates, some interesting problems. I showed you a lot of intermediates. Dr. Gish simply disagrees with that they're intermediates. But remember now, those fossils, according to the creation model, got there in the flood. The volume of fossils, the quantity, the biomass of fossils buried in all those sediments is estimated at several thousand times the mass of living organisms. If they were all on Earth together and they all perished in the flood, then the Earth was covered about 3 feet deep in living organisms. Something for you to consider there. Basic types fully formed. Mammal would be a mammal. Fine. When he starts quoting people like Stephen Jay Gould, he's doing gradualism bashing. Gould is arguing not that there wasn't evolution, not that Archaeopteryx doesn't count as a transitional form between reptiles and birds, but that Archaeopteryx is a bird-like reptile that did not transform slowly, gradually, in every characteristic from reptile to bird. All he's saying is there is no such thing. No evolutionist disputes that. So I showed you intermediates. He quotes Corner in '61 as saying that the plant fossil record supports creationism. But when you're going to criticize a science, you really should criticize the modern form of it and not what was known back in '61. Beck's paleobotany book in '74, another paleobotany book since then in the early '80s have shown very clearly how much the fossil record in regard to plants has changed since 1961. And Corner, were he still active, would agree. Well, again, picking on a form, picking on a part of a science that nobody really accepted then anyway, and that certainly has been discarded. He bashes poor old Goldschmidt as if Goldschmidt's ideas were the very most modern. Stephen Gould likes some of Goldschmidt's ideas because they seem to go along with his idea of punctuated equilibrium. Since they proposed punctuated equilibrium, by the way, people have gone out and looked at the kind of sediments where you would expect to find good, complete transitional records. Very fine, graded sedimentary sections in ocean bottom, lake bottoms, and so on. They have found good evidence for punctuated equilibrium, good evidence in some cases for gradual transitions, and good evidence in another case for what they called punctuated gradualism. Now, he repeated again the stuff about Solly Zuckerman, didn't pay attention to what I said. Australopithecus is not, repeat, not on the direct line of ancestry from humans, or from the apes to humans. It was a parallel line. So to expect to find Australopithecus being more like humans is a total misinterpretation of what anybody says evolution is or did. They're a parallel line. There's no reason in the world for them to evolve toward being more human-like. At least he admitted now that Zuckerman did not look at Australopithecus afarensis. Then he mentions Nebraska man, Piltdown man, and the old Neanderthal man, again, picking on things that happened in the past, but giving these frauds to let you know that evolutionists really are an extremely gullible lot, not very bright. To be fooled by a pig tooth. The pig tooth fooled almost nobody. Piltdown man was placed off with a question mark off on the side. He didn't fit. Who found out that they were not what they were alleged to be? It wasn't a creation scientist. It was a regular old anthropologist in there plugging away, looking at the data, and doing what scientists always do, testing hypotheses and rejecting those that are wrong. That's how we lurch along in science, making a suggestion, an idea, somebody coming along showing that it's hogwash, and showing a better idea for it. Zuckerman's book preceded most human fossils. More hominid fossils have been found since 1970 than had been found in all the time before then. So take that ideas about what Zuckerman had to say with a large, large grain of salt. He didn't have the basis that they have now to make the kinds of decisions. But I do agree that what we think now about exactly what happened with Afarensis and then with Homo habilis and so on will probably change somewhat as we dig up more fossils. But the one thing we're not going to decide is, gee whiz, this Petrolona skull isn't intermediate between Homo sapiens and Homo erectus after all. And remember, Homo erectus, according to my opponent, was a big monkey. Now the biochemical argument. Biochemistry does have to be similar. That is so we can eat each other, but it does not have to fall into the pattern it does. There's no reason why an ape has to have 99% protein similarity, a chimpanzee, to human beings. No reason in the world. All they have to do is be made up of the same 20 amino acids and you can eat them just fine. No reason for those amino acids to be arranged so that many of them are exactly, the proteins are exactly like ours. So that's another straw man, another way of avoiding dealing with the real facts. Denton's supposed data, his supposed powerful destruction, those data don't surprise anybody who has looked at them. They're just a little different way of putting down what's there. If you look at when organisms diverged, when the bacteria diverged from the others, when the lampreys diverged from the others, you expect them to be very, very different because all these things are doing is measuring the time since divergence. When you're going to use molecular tools to describe something, it's like anything else you're going to measure. You've got to use the proper tool. If you want to measure the size of a protozoan, you don't get a yardstick to do it. You get a fine measuring tool. You get yourself a microscope and you measure it with that. If you want to measure the size of something big, you don't get a microscope. You go out and you get a tape measure or a rangefinder. That's the problem with the cytochrome C data. Cytochrome C is a very conservative molecule. It's good for showing us time of divergence, patterns of divergence, sense, all about the level of phyla. Not much less than that. People were amazed, in fact, that it fit the picture below the phyla as well as it does. But you do expect phyla to be about as different from each other as they are on the basis. Same thing with the hemoglobin data that he showed. Use the proper tool. Don't use improper tools for things. Otherwise, you're going to come up with improper answers. Well, I think I've said enough for the moment. I'll quit early because everybody's back ends are surely asleep. Thank you.
Let me quote from a book. Let me quote from the book by Dr. Michael Denton. Why I want to do this, he's not a creationist. He does not offer creation as an alternative. He's not a Christian. He has no preconceived notions, you see, that lean towards our point of view. This book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, was published last year. It's available from Harper and Row for about $20, and in my considered opinion, it's worth every dime. Now, on the jacket, it gives a rather brief introduction to what material is included in the book and what Dr. Denton is saying. Now, remember, Dr. Denton has 2 earned doctorates from British universities. He's now in Australia working in genetic engineering. So he's a molecular biologist. He knows what he's talking about. Now, here's what he says. The theory of evolution as propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by a practicing scientist presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence that threatens to destroy every cherished, or almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution. Although the theory has proved to be right about the relatively minor phenomenon of speciation, its larger claims to account for the relationship between classes and orders, let alone the origin of life, appear to be based on very shaky scientific foundations indeed. Not only has paleontology failed spectacularly to come up with the fossil missing links, which Darwin anticipated, but hypothetical reconstructions of major evolutionary developments, such as that linking birds to reptiles, are beginning to look more and more like science fiction fantasies than serious conjectures. Even the currently fashionable theory of punctuated equilibrium cannot adequately fill in the very real gaps we face when envisaging how major groups of plants and animals arose. Most important of all, the discoveries of molecular biologists, of whom Michael Denton is one, far from strengthening Darwinian claims, are throwing more and more doubt upon the correctness of the whole theory. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he's just not referring to some outmoded mechanism of evolution. What Dr. Denton is talking about today is modern evolutionary theory. He talked about this so-called punctuated equilibrium notion. Doesn't solve anything. The idea of Stephen Jay Gould and punctuated equilibrium, let me try to explain what that means. They've given up on slow and gradual change of one type into another. We don't find the transition forms. There's gaps between the species. And so evolution, they say, wasn't slow and gradual, it was jerky. Things just stayed around and didn't change, and all of a sudden they very rapidly changed into something else. And the change was so rapid, it occurred in such few creatures that it just didn't leave any fossils. So you had fossils of one species, fossils of another species, but nothing in between. You ask them, why don't you find evidence for evolution in the present? Evolution is too slow. Why don't you find evidence for evolution in the past? Evolution was too fast. And you just don't find any evidence for evolution. Well, what I'm trying to convey, Dr. Denton is aware of all of these notions. Listen, this notion of punctuated equilibrium doesn't explain anything. It's only supposed to account for the gaps between species. No big deal. What I'm concerned about, these huge gaps between the microscopic creatures and those complex invertebrates, between complex invertebrates and fishes. That's not the difference between species. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a gap of monstrous proportions, of hundreds of millions of years. And no question about it, no intermediate forms. Now, Dr. Awbrey has tried to bring the authority of Nobel Prize winners on his side, and surely he can. I'm not impressed. Truly, Nobel Prize winners are spatialists. A few years ago, I was scheduled to debate Professor Shockley of Stanford University. He's a Nobel Prize winner. It was all set for months. He'd been paid $5,000 in expenses for this debate up at North Dakota State. A month before the debate, he called up and said he wanted to get out of the debate. He found out he was going to debate a scientist. I guess he thought he was going to debate a preacher or something. He begged to be let out of this debate. I got on a conference call with Professor Shockley and the man at North Dakota State, and I said, he said, look, I'm a Nobel laureate. I've got to protect my reputation. And I said, well, Dr. Shockley, why are you an evolutionist? What is the scientific evidence that convinces you? If you're not ready to get up on a public platform and defend it scientifically without being embarrassed, then why are you an evolutionist? Well, he says, when I went to college, I learned about embryological recapitulation and all that stuff, and I thought to myself, boy, you better get out of this debate, because that's a thoroughly discredited notion. Even evolutionists don't believe that anymore. There's your example of a Nobel Prize winner. Somebody said you get a bunch of Nobel Prize winners to sign almost anything. Now, these people are prejudiced towards their own point of view. They are narrow spatialists, and I am not impressed by these statements. He referred to Francis Crick as one of the Nobel Prize winners. Francis Crick does not believe that life has evolved on this earth. He says it's impossible. So he wants life to come from outer space or something like that. Now, Dr. Awbrey says, we've seen an article that says new stars are appearing. We see new stars appearing. I read the article. What these people say, out there, way out there in space, there's some kind of dust or gas or something that is immensely cold. I think he said it's minus 375 degrees, very, very cold. And he said, now if you wait 100,000 years, maybe you'll see a star out there, or a star is forming. All right, let's wait 100,000 years to see if their notions are correct. No, nobody has ever seen a star form, and they're not seeing a star forming. They imagine that that might take place. But we're going to have to wait 100,000 years to see if it's going to take place. Now, Dr. Awbrey criticized Dr. Morris in his book, Scientific Creationism, where Dr. Morris quoted a scientist who said that as far as the fossil record is concerned, that fits creation just as well as evolution. We think, of course, there's no contest, really. But Dr. Awbrey went on to say that this man then said that he thought there's other evidence to support evolution, and that somehow we had misused that evidence. No, not at all. What Dr. Morris was pointing out, that as far as the fossil record is concerned, paleontology, that man admitted that the evidence fits creation very nicely. Now, why he wants to believe in evolution, that's something else. They believe in evolution for all kinds of reasons, but that was not a misuse of the evidence. Dr. Awbrey referred to the Grand Canyon. Ladies and gentlemen, the Grand Canyon is not evidence for evolution. If that is the picture of evolution in the Grand Canyon, then I want Dr. Awbrey to go down there to the Grand Canyon, reach up there in the wall of the Grand Canyon, and pull out these transitional forms that ought to be the record of evolution. He can't do that. I mean, there in the Grand Canyon, all of a sudden, you find a sudden appearance of all these complex invertebrates. There they are, all of a sudden, fully formed. Above that, as he said, there are fish fossils. Well, now, if the Grand Canyon is a record of evolution, Dr. Awbrey should go down there in between these complex invertebrates and those fishes and pull out the intermediates. He couldn't find one down there. And furthermore, there's huge time gaps there in the Grand Canyon. 200 million years, supposedly, between different strata. Absolutely no evidence of any 200 million years. No evidence of folding or falling or canyon cutting or anything. The thing is still there just as level as can be. Our scientists are studying the Grand Canyon and just tremendously impressed by the evidence we have there, not for evolution, but for creation. Dr. Awbrey refers to these so-called human tails. Well, I've read the material on so-called human tails. They are not tails, ladies and gentlemen. They are fatty, fibrous. They had a fatty, fibrous core. And recently, just a couple years ago, all this publicity about this human tail, it was offset from the midline. It was not connected to the spinal column. It did not have any vertebrae in it, nothing like that. It was merely an anomaly, a fatty tumor, which was snipped off under local anesthetic. It was not a tail. And why should humans have tails? Suppose that we evolved from apes. Apes don't have tails. So why should we have anything like that? Now, Dr. Awbrey spent some time on the mammal-like reptiles and claimed that they had both a reptile jaw and a mammalian jaw, side by side. And he said this has happened not once, but 5 times. Isn't that incredible, ladies and gentlemen? First of all, you have this incredibly complex changes that occur by pure chance. Not only did it happen once, not only did it happen twice or 3 times or 4 times, it happened 5 times in separate evolutionary lines by chance, by accident. Dr. Awbrey has tremendous faith to believe something like that. To believe that it even happened once is incredible, but 5 times? Now listen, every mammal, living or fossil, has 3 bones in the ear and 1 bone in the jaw, the dentary. That's true of every mammal, living or fossil. Every reptile, living or fossil, has only 1 bone in the ear and 7 bones in the jaw. And there's not 1 single intermediate ever been found anywhere in the fossil record. And again, I would challenge Dr. Awbrey to explain to this audience how those creatures managed to chew and to hear while they were dragging those bones from the jaw up into the ear. And isn't that incredible that they could do that, take these bones, engineered, designed for a jaw and chewing, somehow are brought up into the ear and incredibly refashioned and re-engineered for hearing. The ear bones that we have are marvelously designed, incredible. And to think it all happened by a series of accidents and mistakes, genetic mistakes, these things took place. And the creature was hearing all the time and also chewing. Now, Dr. Awbrey said it had both a mammalian jaw joint and a reptile jaw joint. And that's what a lot of evolutionists believe, but there are some evolutionists who don't believe that. And I don't believe it either. Now, that creature he's referring to, it's called Morcanucodon. It has a fully functional, powerful reptilian jaw joint. There's no doubt about it. Fully functional, reptilian, powerful reptilian jaw joint. They think possibly there was a contact between the dentary and the squamosal, which you find in mammals. That's strictly an inference, ladies and gentlemen. There's no doubt it had a powerful reptilian jaw joint. How could that creature have a powerful, fully functional reptilian jaw joint and at the same time have a mammalian jaw joint? And here's something else Dr. Awbrey didn't mention. The essential organ of hearing in the mammal is called the organ of Corti, and it's extremely complex structure, and there is nothing resembling that in the mammal. And the gaps between these mammals, or mammal-like reptiles, and the mammals are all the way through are systematic. Now, Dr. Awbrey says that I was not giving you quite the whole story, that we don't need an enzyme with 124 amino acids. You just clip one or two off and find out what happens. You don't have any activity. You've got to have all of that. But supposing he was right, supposing you only had to have 10 amino acids. There are no such thing. There's no such enzyme that has only 10. They all have hundreds of amino acids. Supposing he's right, but you've got to have hundreds of those enzymes. And if you calculate the probability of getting hundreds of these enzymes, even though they are only 10 amino acids each. And that is what Sir Fred Hoyle assumed. He assumed you didn't have to have the entire structure. He assumed you only had to have a small piece. That is what Sir Fred Hoyle assumed. What did he conclude? There was absolutely no probability that everything required for life could have evolved. Ladies and gentlemen, when we look at this evidence now, the huge gaps in the fossil record, undoubted gaps, unbridged gaps, which completely demolishes evolutionary theory. When we consider the laws of thermodynamics, which tells us everything is going from order to disorder, from complex to simple, the opposite of evolution. And when we look at the laws of probability and try to calculate the probability of this marvelously incredible, complex universe and living things evolving by chance, there is only one conclusion that we can make. Ladies and gentlemen, this universe and its living things did not create themselves naturally. They had to be created supernaturally. Thank you.
Five minutes. Start my watch. There we go. Stars forming. Dr. Gish assures you that there's no such thing as a star forming, that he's read these articles. I read them. I find it hard to believe that what he said shows that he read the same articles. These are not just the ones saying, oh my goodness, we've got to wait 100,000 years for this. These are the ones where they say, now we have a star in the right place. Remember, one of the things that they tell us is that no theory of origins can be tested. But the people who are out looking for these new stars are looking where the theories of star formation tell them to look, in molecular clouds. This is exactly where they've found them. And these two articles tell about brand new light. The one in Nature shows a picture taken in 1982. No light there. Then the picture taken in 1986, and there's light. The thing has lit. It is now burning. It's now a nuclear furnace. The creationists would have you believe that the second law of thermodynamics, in their version, it's kind of a far-out version of the second law, does prevent it, but not the version that the universe works on. Now, the whole idea of fossil intermediates, I can see it bothers him an awful lot. How many fossils are there? How many fossil species are there, do you think? He talks about millions and millions and millions of fossil species. There are about 200,000 fossil species. Most of these are shellfish of one kind or another. Land fossils are extremely rare. So the fossils that we have, the number of species that we have, is less than 10% of the living species that have already been described. Probably about 1%, 5% of the species that actually are alive on the earth. And you can take 5% of the pages of a book and reconstruct the whole book from them in great detail. Sure you can. There's no wonder there are gaps there. The gaps, of course, are covered by embryology, biochemistry, that agree with what we can see from the fossil record. So anyway, then of course there's always the get the people's mind off the facts. Humans descended from apes, apes don't have tails, is a good way. It's the same way of when I showed another good vestigial organ in another debate, which was to show that human beings sometimes have supernumerary mammary glands, which occur on the milk line, the same place they occur on any other mammal. This, of course, is interpreted best as that humans were derived from a mammalian species that had mammary glands along the milk line. But like saying, well, apes don't have tails, so how can we have tails? Is just like saying human beings sometimes have an extra pair of functioning mammary glands above these, which is where bats are, and so he says, well, we must have come through the bat stage then. That is a way of getting your minds off the real evidence, which is how do you explain a tail? And remember, he apparently doesn't remember what the article said. Sometimes they do have bony elements and muscles in them. Sometimes they do. And it only takes sometimes to have a vestigial organ like that, which is a leftover from the common ancestor of apes and humans that did have a tail. If you look at a developing human fetus, we do have a tail when we develop. It's a nice long tail, as long as a cow's tail while it's developing in the fetus. Reptile to mammal transition by chance 5 times. Nobody says that the reptile to mammal transition came about by chance. In fact, paleontologists have worked out a very elaborate scheme of exactly what the selective pressures were based on muscular opening and closing of the jaws. Reptiles don't chew. Reptiles, like an alligator, grab something, rips it off, or they swallow things whole. And a reptilian jaw is just not set up for efficient chewing. And the transition came to make chewing more efficient. And I didn't show Morganucodon, by the way. I showed Probanognathus. And anybody who's written books on paleontology certainly should recognize that difference. And I showed you very clearly a drawing taken from those specimens. It's made from the stereo drawings in the original articles. They always film them in 3 dimensions, so you can really see it when you look at them in the original article, that there is a strong connection in Probanognathus between the stapes and the quadrate. Nobody is postulating that there's one there. There is there. Well, and remember, every mammal had you, as an 8-week-old fetus, did have the rectal jaw. And your ear bones did, as I showed you exactly how it could happen, transfer themselves over into the middle ear. I mean, there's not just that much there's not very much difference there. So, time's up. Thank you.
Now, it seems to me that Dr. Awbrey here tonight tried to argue that the fossil record gave evidence for evolution. Now I've just heard him give all the reasons why it shouldn't show evidence for evolution. because of the poverty of the fossil record. There's just too few fossils, you see, and we really wouldn't expect to find all those intermediate forms. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, we wouldn't expect to find all of the intermediate forms. But the fossil record that we have is a very, very adequate sampling of the fossil record. More than adequate. 250,000 different fossil species, tens of thousands of those fossils should be undoubted intermediate forms. Now, furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, you don't need a whole lot of intermediates. You only need a few to be sufficient. But the fact is the gaps are systematic. We have 32 orders of mammals, primates, rodents, whales, bats, hoofed animals, and so forth. 32 orders of mammals, and in every case, each one of these different types appear abruptly fully formed. The first rodent is a rodent. And the first sign of a whale is a whale. The first sign of a bat appears in the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen, fully formed. Supposedly 50 million years old, the first fossil bat we have is 100% bat and has the incredible sonar system of the modern bat. Present in that first bat, not a trace of an ancestor, not a trace of an intermediate form. That's true of all of the flying creatures. The gaps are absolutely systematic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can't plead the poverty of the fossil record. No, the fossil record just doesn't produce the evidence that it must have if evolution is true. Now, Dr. Awbrey referred to Professor Wick-Ramasinghe. What he said down there in Arkansas, listen, I was there in that court during the entire trial. I heard what he said. He condemned evolutionists for their bigotry. He is not a theistic evolutionist. He does not believe in biblical creation, of course. But he believes that wherever life appeared in this universe, it had to be created. And he's published books on it, along with Sir Fred Hoyle. Yes, he is a creationist. Not our kinds of creationists, but he's certainly a creationist. Now, Dr. Awbrey referred to in his argument about the tail, and he refers to mammary glands appearing in various places. Yes, that's true. Some infant girls are born with mammary glands in the armpits, some in the groin area, some on the back. Now, it just so happens that normally the bat has mammary glands in the armpits. That means that that little girl born with mammary glands in the armpits is a throwback to a bat, then you see. It must indicate something like that, according to evolutionists. Now, the little girl born with mammary glands in the groin area, since those are normally appear in the whale or some whales, then I guess you'd say she's the throwback to a whale. If you assume that something that has a fatty tumor in the back region is a throwback to an ape, then you'd have to believe this other facts too. But of course, nobody believes that at all. Dr. Awbrey doesn't believe it, and I don't believe it. No one else believes it. Many things, abnormalities do occur and appear. Someone said it's a miracle that anything is born normally. When you consider the complexity of it, yet almost everything is. But you do have some of these abnormalities. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just let me say in closing, you see, what we have to do is merely weigh the evidence, the credibility of each side. We're not going to have everything 100% for the creationists, nor 100% for the evolutionists. You have to weigh the evidence. And, ladies and gentlemen, when you do that, the weight of the evidence tremendously on the side of the creationists. And yet, in our public schools today, what the evolutionists are saying, we cannot teach that scientific evidence to our students. You see, they must be indoctrinated in the truth, the appropriate truth, by those who consider themselves to be the intellectual elite. We cannot expose these students to the evidence for creation. We don't dare do that. We've got to indoctrinate them in evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a violation of our academic and religious freedom. That's poor education and it's bad science. And I say it's time for a change. Our students ought to have the opportunity to hear both sides of this question just as you have had tonight. Thank you very much.